Love in the 19th century wasn't built on stolen glances and poetry. It was built on cold, hard cash, bloodlines, and brutal social arithmetic. Florence knew the math. She was 26, practically penniless, and possessed a tongue sharp enough to draw blood. Her aunt made sure she knew her exact worth every single morning. "No gentleman will want you," she'd sneered. And she was right. Gentlemen wanted quiet, pliable things. Good thing the man bleeding out his horse on the midnight road wasn't a gentleman. He was a duke. The drawing room of Oakhaven smelled of damp wool and old regret. It was a smell Florence knew better than her own scent. She sat near the window, chasing the fading afternoon light with a needle and thread, attempting to turn the frayed collar of her only decent day dress. The fire in the hearth was an insult. 3 coals. Aunt Agatha monitored the coal scuttle with the intensity of a general defending a siege line. "You are pulling the thread too tight," Agatha said. She didn't look up from her ledger. The scratching of her quill was the only other sound in the room, sharp and unforgiving. "If I leave it loose, the seam will split," Florence replied. Her voice was flat. She had long ago abandoned the high, melodic tone that young women of their station were taught to cultivate. It took too much energy. Agatha finally looked up. Her eyes were hard, pale things, settled in a face that life had pinched tight. She had taken Florence in 8 years ago, when the fever took Florence's parents, and the creditors took the estate. It was an act of charity Agatha ensured Florence paid for every day. A ruined seam would be fitting, Agatha observed, her voice like cracking ice. "It matches the rest of you. I had Lady Danbury over for tea yesterday, Florence. Do you know what she asked me?" Florence didn't pause her stitching. "Whether we had finally managed to trap the rats in the pantry? She asked if you were unwell. You sat there for 20 minutes staring at the wall, and when her nephew attempted to make conversation about the weather, you told him that rain was simply water and required no philosophical debate." Agatha closed the ledger with a sharp snap. "The boy has 2,000 a year. He is dull, yes, but 2,000 a year covers a multitude of dullness. You drove him away. He was trying to explain to me how clouds worked, Aunt. I merely informed him I was familiar with the concept." "You humiliated him." Agatha stood, her cane thumping against the threadbare rug. "You are 26 years old. You have no dowry. Your hair is an entirely unfashionable shade of brown, your jaw is too square, and you possess a willful masculine temper. You are a dependent in my house, eating my food, burning my coal." Florence bit the thread, severing it. She tasted copper. "I am aware of my ledger balance, Aunt." "Are you?" Agatha sneered, leaning heavily on the cane, looming over Florence's chair. "Because you act as though you have the luxury of choice. You act as though waiting for a love match is a privilege afforded to women with empty pockets. It isn't. No gentleman will want you, Florence, not with that mouth, not with that face. You will die a spinster in a cold room, and you will have no one to blame but your own pride." The words didn't shock Florence. They were merely an echo of the internal monologue she recited in the dark. But hearing them spoken aloud in the grey light of the drawing room still felt like a physical blow. She didn't cry. Crying was for women who had someone to comfort them. Florence simply set the dress on the side table, stood up and smoothed her skirts. "I am going to check the boundary fence," she said. "It's about to pour." Agatha snapped. "Then I shall get wet." Florence walked out. She didn't take an umbrella. She grabbed her heavy woolen cloak from the peg by the kitchen door, slipped into her mud-stained boots, and stepped out into the biting wind of the Gloucestershire afternoon. The sky above was the colour of bruised iron. The cold was a relief. It numbed the sting in her chest. She walked with long, purposeful strides toward the edge of the property. Oakhaven had once been a respectable estate, but now it was a decaying house surrounded by overgrown fields and rotting timber. The boundary fence along the post road had been listing for weeks. If it fell, the neighbours' sheep would get into their meagre vegetable garden, and Agatha would talk about it until Christmas. Florence reached the fence just as the first drops of rain began to fall. They were heavy and freezing. She found the broken rail. The wood was splintered, the nails rusted and bent. She cursed under her breath, pulling her cloak tighter, and knelt in the mud to try and wedge the rail back into the post. Her hands were bare. She hadn't thought to grab gloves. The rough wood bit into her palms, but she welcomed the friction. It was a tangible, fixable problem. She shoved her shoulder against the damp timber, groaning with the effort. It wouldn't budge. She stepped back, wiped a streak of wet mud across her forehead with the back of her hand, and kicked the fence post hard. That seems a poor strategy for carpentry. The voice came from the road. It was deep, resonant, and carried a faint trace of aristocratic drawl. The kind of voice that usually demanded brandy in a warm club, not one found on a miserable dirt track in a rainstorm. Florence spun around. A carriage was halted on the road, half tilted into the ditch. It was a massive, imposing thing, painted black, with crests on the doors that were currently covered in muck. One of the rear wheels was sunk deep in the Gloucestershire clay. Standing a few yards away, watching her over the broken fence, was a man. Victor hated the country. He hated the city too, but the city had paved roads. He had been travelling since dawn, fleeing London and the suffocating grasp of Lady Jersey's matchmaking machinations. Being the Duke of Westmoreland came with a staggering fortune, vast political influence, and a target on his back the size of St. Paul's Cathedral. He was 30, unmarried, and thoroughly exhausted by the performance of his own existence. Every smile he received was calculated. Every dropped handkerchief was a tactical maneuver. He had decided to retreat to his friend Harrington's estate to shoot birds and avoid human contact for a month. Instead, his driver had taken a corner too fast, the road had given way, and now his custom-built carriage was embedded in a ditch. He had stepped out into the freezing rain to assess the damage, thoroughly prepared to unleash a blistering tirade on his coachman. But before he could open his mouth, he had heard a dull thud and a creative string of profanities coming from the other side of the hedgerow. He had walked over and found a woman kicking a fence. She didn't look like any woman Victor was accustomed to seeing. She was wrapped in a shapeless, hideous grey cloak. Her hair, a dark, heavy brown, was escaping its pins and sticking to her wet cheeks. Her face was smeared with mud. She lacked the delicate, porcelain fragility prized in the ballrooms he had just escaped. Her features were strong, a sharp jaw, a straight nose, and dark eyes that currently looked at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated hostility. "Are you addressing me?" she asked. Her voice was surprisingly steady, lacking the breathy pitch women usually adopted when they realized who he was. Then again, she had no idea who he was. "I am the only other person here," Victor pointed out, resting his gloved hands on the handle of his walking stick. "Unless you frequently converse with the sheep. The sheep offer better advice," she shot back. She didn't curtsy. She didn't even adjust her posture. She simply stood her ground in the mud. "And they don't state the obvious. My fence is broken. Your carriage is stuck. I would say we both have better things to do than critique each other's methods." Victor felt a strange jolt of surprise. It wasn't offense. It was genuine amusement. It had been years since someone had spoken to him without running their words through a filter of deference. "Fair enough," he said. He glanced at the splintered rail. "You lack the leverage to push it back into the joint. The wood is swollen with the damp." "I am aware of the physics of wet wood," she said tightly. "I am trying to force it. May I?" Victor didn't wait for her answer. He stepped over the low stone wall bordering the road, his expensive hessians sinking immediately into the muck. His valet was going to weep. He walked up to the fence. Up close, he realized she wasn't as tall as she had seemed, just fiercely postured. She smelled of rain, wet wool, and faintly of lavender soap. Hold the top rail, he instructed. She stared at him, her eyes narrowing. He noticed her hands. They were red with the cold, calloused at the fingers. Working hands? Not the hands of a lady of leisure. I don't need your help, she said. My carriage is missing a wheel spoke, and my driver is currently walking 3 miles to the nearest village for a blacksmith. I have nothing but time, madam. Hold the rail. She hesitated, then grabbed the wet wood. Victor placed his hands, large, strong, and clad in fine leather, next to hers on the lower rail. On 3, he said. 1, 2, 3. They shoved together. The combined weight and angle forced the swollen timber back into the joint with a sickening crunch. The fence held. Florence stepped back, breathless, rubbing her raw hands together. Thank you. She forced the words out. It sounded as though they tasted sour. You're welcome, Victor said, turning to look at her fully. The rain was coming down harder now, soaking through his greatcoat. I don't suppose you live nearby and have a fire. Florence looked at him. She took in the cut of his coat, the quality of his cravat, the arrogant, easy way he held himself, even in a muddy ditch. He was handsome, in a severe, architectural sort of way. High cheekbones, dark hair plastered to his forehead, and eyes that were a pale, piercing grey. He reeked of money. She thought of Aunt Agatha sitting in the freezing drawing room, hoarding her 3 coals. My home is not suitable for receiving guests, Florence said flatly. Victor's eyebrow twitched upward. I am standing in a puddle. My standards are currently very low. And my aunt's desire to humiliate me in front of wealthy strangers is very high. You would not enjoy the tea, sir, and I would not enjoy the aftermath. She was blunt, brutally so. Victor stared at her. Women simply did not speak like this. They obfuscated. They fluttered. They made excuses about the servants being ill or the parlor being redecorated. They didn't look a man in the eye and admit to poverty and familial hostility. You are a remarkably forthright woman, Victor said. I find lying takes too much effort, and I have very little energy to spare. Florence pulled her cloak tighter. The village of Oakhaven is 2 miles down that road. There is an inn, the Boar and Whistle. It has a fire and passable ale. I suggest you wait there for your man. She turned to leave. Wait, Victor said. The word was out of his mouth before he could stop it. She paused, looking back over her shoulder. The rain was washing the mud from her cheek, revealing pale, cold skin. I never got your name, he said. No, Florence said softly. You didn't. And with that she walked away, disappearing into the grey sheets of rain, leaving the Duke of Westmoreland standing ankle-deep in mud, staring after her. The estate of Lord Harrington was everything Oakhaven was not. It was a temple to excess, blazing with candlelight and roaring fires. When Victor finally arrived, hours late, smelling of damp wool and wet horse, Harrington had laughed until he choked on his port. Westmoreland, you look like a grave robber. His friend had wheezed, ushering him toward the grand staircase. Get bathed. My wife has half the county coming for a dinner party tonight. You are the guest of honor. Victor had bathed. He had allowed his valet to scrape the country off him, dressing in impeccable evening clothes, stark black and pristine white. He descended into the dining room, looking exactly like the Duke of Westmoreland was expected to look, cold, powerful, and utterly unreachable. The dinner was agonizing. He sat at the head of the table next to Lady Harrington, surrounded by the local gentry. They were all desperately trying to impress him. The women simpered. The men boasted about their hounds. Victor ate his roasted pheasant and gave non-committal answers, his mind drifting. He kept seeing the woman in the mud. My aunt's desire to humiliate me in front of wealthy strangers is very high. Who was she? The raw honesty of the interaction had rattled him. In his world, everyone wanted something from him. That woman had looked at him, seen exactly what he was, and decided she wanted absolutely nothing to do with him. She had chosen the freezing rain over his company. "Your Grace?" Victor blinked, pulling his attention back to the table. Lady Harrington was looking at him with an expectant smile. "Forgive me, Lady Harrington. The journey was taxing. What did you say?" "I was merely asking if you found the local scenery appealing." She chirped. "Though I fear the roads are dreadful. We heard your carriage suffered a mishap near the old Penrose property." Victor stilled. "The Penrose property?" "Yes, just bordering our estate to the south. A tragic situation, really." Lady Harrington lowered her voice, leaning in with the eager posture of a practiced gossip. "Old Mr. Penrose lost everything in a mining speculation. Died of apoplexy. His wife followed soon after. The house is a ruin. Only the sister-in-law lives there now, an awful woman named Agatha Hawley, and the niece." "The niece," Victor repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "Yes, Florence, a tragic case." Lady Harrington sighed, though her eyes gleamed. "Penniless, of course, and quite on the shelf. She must be 26 by now. Between us, Your Grace, she is entirely unmarriageable. A dreadful temper. She insulted Lord Danbury's nephew just yesterday. Sent him packing. Her aunt is at her wits' end." Victor looked down at his crystal wine glass. He saw the reflection of the candlelight in the dark red liquid. "I find lying takes too much effort." He looked up, his pale grey eyes fixing on Lady Harrington with an intensity that made the older woman flinch slightly. "Is that so?" Victor said smoothly. "How unfortunate for her." He didn't hear a single word spoken for the rest of the evening. 10 miles away, Florence sat in the dark. The 3 coals had burned down to ash hours ago. She was in her bedroom, wrapped in 2 thin blankets, listening to the wind rattle the loose window panes. She had returned from the fence, soaked to the bone. Aunt Agatha had been waiting. The carriage on the road had not gone unnoticed by the few servants they still employed. The gossip had reached the kitchen before Florence had even managed to take off her wet boots. Agatha had found out the crest on the carriage belonged to the Duke of Westmoreland. The explosion had been spectacular. "You spoke to him!" Agatha had shrieked, her face mottled purple with rage. "You stood in the mud, looking like a beggar, and spoke to the Duke of Westmoreland? You insolent, stupid girl! You could have invited him in! You could have offered shelter!" "I offered him directions to a pub." Florence had replied wearily. "We have no fire, Aunt. What shelter were we to offer? Our draughty parlour? You have ruined us! If word gets out that we treated a duke like a common traveller—" Agatha had raised her hand, her fingers trembling, pointing at Florence's face. "You are poison, Florence. You ruin everything you touch with your pride. I told you this morning, no gentleman will ever want you. And you just proved it to the highest peer in the county." Florence pulled the blankets tighter around her shoulders, shivering violently. Her bones ached from the damp, but the ache in her chest was worse. She had known who he was. She hadn't recognized the crest, but she had recognized the air of authority, the inherent assumption that the world would yield to him. She had sent him away because Agatha was right. If Victor Cavendish had walked into Oakhaven, he would have seen the rot. He would have seen the poverty, the desperation, the pathetic clinging to faded gentility. And he would have looked at Florence not with the amused respect he had shown at the fence, but with pity. Florence could survive cruelty. She had survived it for 8 years, but she could not survive pity. She closed her eyes, trying to force sleep, but every time she drifted off, she felt the rough, cold wood of the fence under her hands and saw the startling, piercing grey of the stranger's eyes. She was 26. She was poor. She was alone. And for the first time in her life, sitting in the freezing dark, Florence Penrose cried. Morning at the Harrington estate was a symphony of wealth, soft slippers on thick carpets, Silver cloches lifted to reveal coddled eggs and hothouse peaches. The smell of expensive coffee roasting over a hardwood fire. Victor sat in the breakfast room, a newspaper completely ignored in his hands, staring out the vast bay windows. The rain had stopped, leaving the Gloucestershire countryside looking bruised and washed out. "You are uncommonly quiet, Westmoreland," Harrington noted, loading his plate with heavily buttered toast. Still mourning the carriage wheel? Thinking about the local geography. Victor murmured. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the muddy, defiant face of Florence Penrose. The women in Victor's world were cultivated flowers, grown in glass houses, shielded from the wind. Florence was a root torn out of the earth, dirty and stubbornly clinging to life. He couldn't stop wondering what it took to break a woman down to that level of raw, biting honesty. By 10 o'clock, he could no longer stand the clinking of silver and the smell of hot sugar. He ordered a horse saddled. He didn't take a groom. He rode out alone, tracing the route his ruined carriage had taken the day before. The road was deeply rutted, the mud half frozen in the morning chill. Oakhaven appeared over a rise, and Victor felt a tight, uncomfortable pull in his chest. From a distance, it had the shape of a grand manor. Up close, it was a carcass. The stone was black with damp and ivy. The roof slumped in the middle like a broken spine. The gardens were a tangle of dead briars and rotting weeds. He dismounted, tied his horse to a rusting iron ring by the front steps, and used the heavy brass knocker. It echoed hollowly inside. Minutes passed. Finally, the door opened. A young maid stood there, her apron stained with soot, her eyes going wide as saucers as she took in Victor's polished boots, his immaculately tailored riding coat, and the cold authority in his pale grey eyes. "I am the Duke of Westmoreland," Victor said, his voice flat. "I am here to call upon Miss Penrose and her aunt." The maid squeaked, stepped back, and practically bolted down the hall. Victor let himself in. The foyer smelled of floor wax and desperation. The cold in the house was bone deep, worse than the winter air outside because it felt trapped, stagnant. A door down the hall slammed open. Footsteps hurried toward him, accompanied by the frantic thumping of a cane. Agatha Hawley rounded the corner. She was a thin, sharp-edged woman wearing a dress that had been fashionable a decade ago. The moment she saw him, her face contorted into an expression of obsequious terror and greedy delight. It was a look Victor had seen on politicians and debt-ridden gamblers, and he despised it instantly. "Your Grace." Agatha dropped into a deep, trembling curtsy. We are honoured beyond words. Had I known, the house is, please, come into the drawing room. It is the greatest honour." Victor offered a stiff nod. "Mrs. Hawley, I presume. Forgive the intrusion. My carriage suffered an accident on your boundary yesterday. Your niece was of some assistance. I came to formally express my gratitude." Agatha's smile froze. Her eyes darted nervously. "Florence? Assistance? Your Grace, I am mortified. She is a crude, clumsy girl. She had no business speaking to you. I found her quite capable," Victor said coldly, following Agatha into the drawing room. The room was exactly as Florence had described it. Draughty, shabby. A single pathetic fire burned in the grate, giving off no heat whatsoever. "Please sit," Agatha fluttered, gesturing to a faded velvet armchair. "I will send for tea, and I will have Florence brought down to apologize for whatever insolence she surely showed you." "That won't be necessary," Victor began, but Agatha was already yelling for the maid in the hallway. He stood by the cold fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, waiting. 10 minutes later, the door clicked open. Florence stepped into the room. She was wearing a faded blue day dress that was mended at the elbows. Her dark hair was pinned up severely, pulling the skin tight across her sharp cheekbones. She looked pale, tired, and deeply guarded. When she saw him standing there, A muscle in her jaw jumped. Her eyes flicked from Victor to Agatha, calculating the exact level of disaster unfolding. "Florence," Agatha hissed, her voice dripping with venom masked as politeness. "His Grace has come to accept your apology." Florence stood perfectly still. She looked at Victor. He saw the flush of humiliation creep up her neck, staining her pale skin. She knew exactly why he was there. He wasn't there for an apology. He was there to inspect the ruin. "I was unaware I owed one," Florence said. Her voice was quiet, stripped of the fire she had shown in the rain. It was the voice of a prisoner. "You left a duke standing in the mud!" Agatha snapped. "Apologize this instant!" Victor took a step forward. "Mrs. Hawley, please. Miss Penrose owes me no apology. In fact, I owe her one. I came to ask after her hands. The wood on that fence was rough." Agatha blinked, utterly derailed. "Her hands?" "Yes." Victor didn't look at the older woman. He kept his eyes locked on Florence. "I fear the splintered wood may have caused injury." Florence held his gaze. There was no gratitude in her dark eyes. Only a bitter, sharp resentment. He was playing a gentleman's game, and she was the pawn. "My hands are perfectly fine, Your Grace," she said, clasping them tightly together in front of her. "It is kind of you to inquire, and entirely unnecessary." "I decide what is necessary," Victor replied softly. "I see." Florence gave a shallow, mocking nod. "Then I thank you for fulfilling your noble obligation. If you will excuse me, the kitchen requires my attention. We are short-staffed." "You will stay right here," Agatha ordered, her face flushing with rage. "His Grace is our guest." "His Grace is a tourist," Florence said flatly. The words dropped into the room like heavy stones. Agatha gasped. Victor went completely still. Florence looked Victor directly in the eye, stripping away the polite veneer. "You wanted to see it, didn't you? The house, the poverty. You wanted to see if I was telling the truth about the fire. Well, here it is, Your Grace. The roof leaks, the coal is rationed, and we are completely ruined. I hope the reality matches the entertainment value you sought." Silence swallowed the room, thick and suffocating. Agatha looked as though she might actually faint. Her hand gripped her cane so hard her knuckles were bone white. "Go to your room," she whispered, her voice shaking with an anger so absolute it bordered on madness. "Get out of my sight." Florence didn't flinch. She gave Victor one last, lingering look, a look that told him he had crossed a line he didn't even know existed, and walked out of the room, her spine completely straight. Victor watched the empty doorway, a cold sensation washing over him. He had thought he was being chivalrous. He had thought he was showing an interest. But she was right. He had walked into her cage just to look at the bars. "Your Grace, I am ruined with shame," Agatha stammered, pulling his attention back. She was trembling. "She is unstable. Her mind, the poverty has broken her wits. Please, you must believe me. This is not how Oakhaven operates. We are a respectable family." Victor looked at the older woman. He saw the cruelty baked into the lines of her face. He saw the way she looked at her niece, not as family, but as a burden, a scapegoat. "Mrs. Hawley," Victor said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. The aristocratic drawl vanished, replaced by the tone that made politicians sweat. "I suggest you choose your next words with extreme care." Agatha blinked, stepping back. "Your Grace? You speak of respectability while you let your niece repair fencing in a rainstorm without gloves. You speak of shame while you humiliate her in front of a stranger. Miss Penrose is the only person in this house who possesses an ounce of dignity." He didn't wait for her to respond. He turned on his heel and walked out of the drawing room, his heavy boots echoing on the bare floorboards of the hall. He wanted to find Florence. He wanted to explain. Explain what? That he found her fascinating? That her misery had somehow cured his boredom? No, that would only confirm her accusation. He let himself out the front door, untied his horse, and mounted. The ride back to the Harrington estate was a blur of cold wind and bitter self-reproach. He was a duke. He possessed the power to change lives with a flick of his wrist. But Florence Penrose didn't want his money, and she certainly didn't want his pity. For the first time in his adult life, Victor Cavendish had no idea what to do. Back at Oakhaven, the storm had finally broken. Florence sat on the edge of her narrow bed, listening to Agatha's screaming echo up the stairwell. The older woman was tearing through the lower floor, throwing books, overturning chairs. Eventually, the footsteps came up the stairs. The door to Florence's room slammed open, hitting the wall with a crack. Agatha stood in the doorway, breathing heavily, her face a mask of pure hatred. "You are done," Agatha hissed, her voice vibrating. "I have housed you. I have fed you. I have tolerated your miserable, ungrateful existence for 8 years, hoping against hope that some blind, desperate fool might take you off my hands." Florence didn't look up. She kept her eyes on the frayed hem of her quilt. "I am sorry you felt the investment yielded poor returns, Aunt." "Don't you dare mock me!" Agatha stepped into the room, raising her cane. For a second, Florence thought she was going to strike her. She didn't. She slammed the cane into the floor. "You insulted the Duke of Westmoreland. You called him a tourist. He left the house in a rage. Do you understand what you have done? He will speak to Lord Harrington. We will be cut from what little society we have left. The butcher will stop our credit." "The butcher stopped our credit 2 weeks ago, Aunt," Florence pointed out, her voice devoid of emotion. "And the Duke will forget we exist by tomorrow morning. I will not take that chance." Agatha leaned in, her pale eyes wide and feverish. "You are leaving." Florence finally looked up. A cold prickle of genuine fear traced its way up her spine. "Leaving? My cousin, Mrs. Higgins, wrote to me a month ago. She lives in York. She is bedridden, blind, and requires a companion to empty her chamber pots and read to her. I threw the letter in the fire because I would not subject a dog to that woman's house." Agatha smiled, a thin, cruel stretching of lips. "But I saved the direction. You will pack your trunk. There is a mail coach that passes through the village at midnight. You will be on it." "York?" Florence stood up. The fear was spreading now, turning the blood in her veins to ice. York was hundreds of miles away. A one-way ticket to servitude in a stranger's house. It was a death sentence for her spirit. "You cannot turn me out in the middle of the night." "Watch me," Agatha spat. "You have until 11 o'clock to pack your miserable rags. The gardener's boy will take your trunk to the inn in the wheelbarrow. If you are not out of this house by midnight, I will have the constable remove you for trespassing. You are no longer my niece. You are nothing." Agatha turned and walked out, pulling the door shut behind her. The lock clicked. Florence stood in the center of the freezing room. The silence rushed back in, ringing in her ears. She walked over to the small, cracked mirror resting on her washstand. She looked at her reflection. She looked at the square jaw Agatha hated, the dark hair, the tired eyes. No gentleman will want you. Agatha had finally won. The math had zeroed out. Florence had nothing left to calculate. Mechanically, completely numb, she walked to her small wardrobe and pulled out her battered leather trunk. The clock in Lord Harrington's library chimed 11. Victor sat in a deep leather armchair by the fire, a glass of untouched brandy in his hand. The house was quiet. The other guests had retired, but Victor's mind was racing. He kept replaying the scene in the Oakhaven drawing room. He had handled it terribly. He had charged in like an invading force, completely blind to the fragile ecosystem of abuse and survival she lived in. By confronting her aunt, he hadn't protected Florence. He had abandoned her to the fallout. A sharp knock at the library door shattered the silence. Victor frowned. "Come in." The door opened to reveal Harrington's head butler, looking deeply apologetic and slightly rumpled, as if he had dressed in a hurry. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Grace. There is a young boy at the kitchen door. He works as a groundskeeper at the Oakhaven estate. He walked the 3 miles in the dark. He insists he must speak with you. I tried to turn him away, but he is fiercely persistent." Victor set the brandy glass down with a sharp clack. "Bring him in. Here, Your Grace. In the library? Now, man, do it." A moment later, a boy of no more than 12 was shoved into the room. He was shivering, covered in mud up to his knees, clutching a ragged wool cap in his hands. He looked terrified. "You asked for me?" Victor said, keeping his voice gentle. The boy swallowed hard. "You're the Duke? The one who fixed the fence with Miss Florence?" "I am. It's Miss Florence, sir." The boy's voice cracked. "The old bat, Mrs. Hawley, I mean, she went completely mad after you left. Screaming and throwing things. She locked Miss Florence in her room. And now—" The boy wiped his nose on his sleeve. "Now she's sending her away." Victor stood up. His chest tightened. "Where?" "York, sir. To be a servant for some awful relative. The mail coach comes through the village at midnight. Mrs. Hawley made me load Miss Florence's trunk into the wheelbarrow. I'm supposed to take it down to the Boar and Whistle, but Miss Florence, she's always been good to me. She sneaks me bread when the cook isn't looking. I didn't know what to do. I heard the kitchen maid say you gave the old bat a dressing down, so I ran here." Victor looked at the clock. It was 11:15. York, a life of indentured misery. A slow, grinding erasure of the proud, fierce woman he had met in the rain. And it was his fault. His arrogant, careless intrusion had triggered the final trapdoor beneath her feet. "Where is she now?" Victor asked, his voice sharp like cracking ice. "Walking to the village, sir. Alone in the dark. The coach stops at midnight." Victor didn't say another word. He bypassed the boy, strode past the bewildered butler, and went straight out the front doors of the estate. He didn't wait for a groom. He didn't bother with a coat. He ran to the stables, threw a saddle over his massive black gelding himself, yanked the girth tight, and swung up. The horse protested the rough handling, dancing sideways, but Victor dug his heels in. They tore out of the stable yard, the horse's hooves churning the gravel. Victor turned toward the village of Oakhaven, the cold night air biting into his chest through his thin linen shirt. The moon was hidden behind a thick bank of clouds. The road was a treacherous ribbon of black mud and deep ruts. A sensible rider would have taken it at a slow trot. Victor pushed the gelding into a full, reckless gallop. The wind roared in his ears. Trees whipped past like ghosts. The horse slipped twice, stumbling in the deep clay, but Victor held him up with sheer force of will, driving him forward. "No gentleman will want you." The words Lady Harrington had gossiped at dinner echoed in his mind. Penniless, unmarriageable, a dreadful temper. They were all fools. Every single one of them. They couldn't see the fire for the smoke. Florence possessed more courage, more raw, unvarnished integrity in her muddy boots than every glittering aristocrat in London combined. She was not a charity case. She was not a novelty. She was an equal. And she was about to vanish into the dark because he hadn't known how to tell her that. The lights of the village finally appeared in the distance, a few dim yellow squares against the blackness. Victor urged the sweating, lathered horse faster, leaping a low stone wall to cut across a frozen pasture, shaving precious minutes off the ride. He hit the main street of the village just as the massive, heavy wheels of the Royal Mail coach rumbled to a halt outside the Boar and Whistle. The driver was already shouting down to the innkeeper. Through the gloom, illuminated by the swinging lanterns of the inn, Victor saw her. Florence stood by the side of the road. She was wearing the same shapeless grey cloak, holding a small, battered satchel. Her face was completely hidden in the shadows of her hood. She looked tiny against the massive bulk of the stagecoach. She looked defeated. Victor pulled hard on the reins. The massive black horse reared, its iron-shod hooves striking sparks off the cobblestones, letting out a piercing whinny that shattered the quiet of the village. Florence turned. The stagecoach driver swore. The innkeeper froze. Victor didn't bother finding the stirrup. He vaulted off the horse before it had fully settled, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. He tossed the reins toward the stunned innkeeper and walked straight toward the coach. Straight toward her. The driver of the Royal Mail coach was a man who respected a schedule more than he respected God. He leaned over the box, his face red with the biting wind, and glared at the man who had just nearly caused a pile-up in the middle of a muddy village street. "Here now!" The driver bellowed, his voice cutting through the snorting of the lathered black gelding. "Move that beast. We have 5 minutes to make the change, and we are already running late from Gloucester." Victor ignored him. He didn't even look up at the box. His eyes were locked entirely on the woman standing on the cobblestones. Florence hadn't moved. The hood of her cloak hid the expression on her face, but Victor could see the rigid tension in her shoulders. She gripped the handle of her battered leather satchel so tightly, her knuckles shone white in the dim lantern light of the Boar and Whistle. He walked toward her. The freezing mud sucked at his expensive boots. The wind whipped his thin linen shirt against his chest, stealing the heat from his skin in seconds, but he didn't feel the cold. "Miss Penrose," Victor said. His voice was not the booming command of a duke. It was quiet, ragged at the edges, stripped of all its polished armor. Florence finally tilted her head up. Her face was pale, her dark eyes wide and guarded. "What are you doing here?" "Get in the coach, miss!" The driver shouted again, cracking his whip against the footboard for emphasis. "I'm not waiting on a lover's quarrel. You have a ticket or you don't." Victor didn't break eye contact with Florence. He reached into the pocket of his breeches, pulled out a heavy gold sovereign, and tossed it blindly over his shoulder. The coin landed with a heavy clink on the roof of the coach. "The lady is not travelling to York," Victor said, loud enough for the driver to hear. "Leave her trunk with the innkeeper. Drive on." The driver looked at the gold coin, looked at the massive black horse, and then looked at the cut of Victor's trousers. He was a working man, but he recognized power when it stood in the street and threw gold at his feet. He tipped his hat, yelled at the hostlers to drop the trunk, and snapped the reins. The heavy coach lurched forward, its iron-rimmed wheels grinding against the stones, rolling out of the village and taking Florence's sentence of exile with it. Florence watched the coach disappear into the dark. Then she turned to gaze back to Victor. There was no relief in her eyes. There was only a deep, simmering fury. "Who gave you the right?" she demanded, her voice shaking slightly, betraying the exhaustion beneath her anger. "Who gave you the right to decide where I go? To throw your money at my life as if it were a game you could rig?" "It wasn't a game." Victor took a step closer. The wind bit into him again, and he couldn't suppress a violent shiver. "It was a mistake. My mistake. I walked into your aunt's house without thinking of the consequences it would have for you. I underestimated her cruelty." "You underestimated my reality?" Florence shot back, refusing to back down. She stood her ground, an island in the mud. "I told you what would happen. I told you I could not afford the consequences of your curiosity, and you pushed your way in anyway, just to prove you could. And now my aunt has thrown me out, and you have sent away my only means of shelter." York was not shelter. It was a prison. "It was a roof!" Florence yelled. The sudden volume of her voice echoed off the stone walls of the inn. A few patrons peered out the leaded windows, but she didn't care. "It was a roof, and it was food, and it was all I had left. You do not get to ride down here on your high horse and play the savior when you are the one who set the fire." "Then let me put it out." Victor closed the remaining distance between them. He stopped less than a foot away from her. Up close, Florence could see the physical toll the ride had taken on him. His chest heaved. His hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat and damp. He was wearing nothing but evening breeches, tall boots, and a thin white shirt that offered zero protection against the brutal Gloucestershire winter. His lips were tinged blue. He was freezing to death in the middle of the street. Florence stared at him. The cynical arithmetic in her head ground to a halt. Men like the Duke of Westmoreland did not ride without coats. They did not ruin their clothes. They did not shiver. "You are not wearing a coat," she said, the anger suddenly draining out of her, replaced by a jarring sense of unreality. "I was in a hurry," Victor replied through chattering teeth. "You are an idiot," she whispered. "Undoubtedly." He looked down at her, his pale grey eyes intense and unwavering. "But I am an idiot who is asking you to come inside out of the cold. Please, Florence, give me 10 minutes to explain myself. If you still want to leave after that, I will hire a private carriage and send you to York myself. I swear it." Florence looked at his blue lips. She looked at his hands, which were curled into fists to stop the trembling. He was offering her a choice, a real, tangible choice, stripped of the heavy-handed authority he was born with. She let out a long, ragged breath, the white plume of it caught in the lantern light. 10 minutes, she said, "and order a pot of tea. If you die of exposure in the street, my aunt will somehow find a way to blame me for it." The private parlour of the Boar and Whistle smelled faintly of old tobacco and spilled ale, but the fire roaring in the massive stone hearth was glorious. The innkeeper had taken one look at Victor, recognized the terrifying aura of a freezing nobleman, and immediately cleared the back room. He had brought a heavy wool blanket, a steaming pot of black tea, and a bottle of his best brandy before fleeing and shutting the door tight. Victor stood aggressively close to the fire, the wool blanket wrapped tightly around his shoulders over his wet shirt. The violent shivering was beginning to subside, replaced by a deep, aching exhaustion. Florence sat in a high-backed wooden chair on the opposite side of the hearth. She had pushed her hood back, but she hadn't taken off her cloak. She sat with her spine perfectly straight, her hands wrapped around a thick ceramic mug of tea, letting the heat seep into her calloused palms. Silence stretched between them, heavy and crackling with the heat of the fire. "I am listening," Florence finally said, taking a sip of the scalding tea. Victor turned away from the flames to face her. He didn't bother with a polished introduction. He had learned his lesson about hiding behind manners with this woman. "I hate my life," Victor said flatly. Florence paused, the mug halfway to her lips. She raised an eyebrow. "Forgive me if my heart does not bleed for the Duke of Westmoreland. I imagine the burden of immense wealth and total societal freedom is crushing. It is suffocating," Victor corrected, ignoring her sarcasm. "Every interaction I have is a transaction. Every word spoken to me is calculated for maximum return. The women I am expected to court are bred to be agreeable, quiet, and completely devoid of independent thought. They do not want me. They want the title, the estates, and the access to the king. I have spent the last 10 years surrounded by a sea of smiling liars." Florence set her mug down on the small table beside her. "And what does this have to do with me? I am not in your sea. I am drowning in a completely different ocean, because you did not lie to me." Victor dropped the blanket from his shoulders. He didn't care about the cold anymore. He walked over and sat in the chair opposite hers, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Yesterday, in the mud, you looked at me and told me exactly what you thought of me. Today, in your drawing room, you looked me in the eye and stripped away every polite fiction your aunt tried to build. You are the most terrifyingly honest creature I have ever met. Honesty is not a virtue, Your Grace. It is a byproduct of having nothing left to lose. I don't care what it is a byproduct of. I care that it is real." Victor held her gaze. The flickering firelight threw sharp shadows across his cheekbones. "I saw the way you survive. I saw the intelligence in it and the sheer brutal grit. You do not belong in York, emptying chamber pots for a ghost. You belong at the head of a table, terrifying politicians and managing an estate that actually requires a spine." Florence's heart gave a strange, uncomfortable thud against her ribs. She gripped the wooden armrests of her chair. She was a cynical woman. She knew how the world worked, but the raw intensity in his eyes was disorienting. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "I am asking you to marry me." The words dropped into the small, warm room like an anvil. Florence stared at him. She waited for the punchline. She waited for the cruel smirk, the reveal of the joke. But Victor's face remained completely serious, completely open. "You are mad," Florence breathed. "The cold has frozen your wits." "I am entirely lucid. I am 26, she said, her voice rising, panic and anger warring in her chest. "I have no dowry. My family is ruined. I am considered completely unmarriageable by every gentleman in the county. Good thing I am not a gentleman," Victor replied smoothly. "I am a duke. I answer to no one." "Stop it!" Florence stood up, pacing away from the fire into the shadows of the room. She felt like an animal caught in a trap that suddenly sprang open, unsure if the open door was just a different kind of snare. "You do not want a wife. You want a rebellion. You want to shock your polite society by dragging a mud-stained, penniless spinster into their drawing rooms and watching them gasp. I will not be your prop. You think I care enough about society to put on a show for them?" Victor stood up and crossed the room, stopping her pacing by stepping directly into her path. "Florence, look at me." She looked up. His face was inches from hers. "I do not want a prop. I want a partner," Victor said, his voice dropping to a low, rough whisper. "I want a woman who will tell me when I am being an arrogant fool. I want a woman who knows what it costs to survive, who will not break the first time the wind blows cold. I want you." Florence searched his eyes. She looked for the pity. She looked for the charity. She found neither. She found only a desperate, aching need for something genuine. For a connection that wasn't built on a ledger. "I am not pliable," she warned him, her voice trembling slightly. "I will not smile when I am angry. I will not agree with you just because you hold the purse strings. If you ever start agreeing with me just because of my money, I will divorce you," Victor said, a faint, genuine smile finally breaking across his face. Florence let out a breath that sounded half like a laugh, half like a sob. The sheer absurdity of it all crashed over her. She was standing in a shabby inn parlor at midnight, being proposed to by a duke in a wet shirt. The arithmetic of her life had always been simple. 0 assets, 0 prospects. But looking at Victor Cavendish, she realized the math had just changed entirely. "I want my own allowance," Florence said, lifting her chin, her dark eyes flashing with the old fire. "I will not beg you for pin money." Victor's smile widened into something dangerously handsome. "Done. And I want absolute control over the estate gardens, all of them. They are yours. And," Florence hesitated, her throat suddenly tight, "I want to never ever be cold again." Victor reached out. He didn't ask permission. He simply took her cold, calloused hands in his large, warm ones. His grip was firm, grounding, and incredibly safe. "You have my word, Florence," he said softly. "You will never cold again." The morning light in Gloucestershire was always pale and unforgiving, but as the heavy black carriage with the Westmoreland crest rolled up the long, rutted drive of Oakhaven, the sun finally broke through the grey clouds. Victor sat across from Florence. He was properly dressed now, having sent a rider to Harrington's estate at dawn to fetch fresh clothes and his fixed carriage. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal coat, looking every inch the terrifying peer of the realm. But his eyes, when they looked at Florence, were warm. Florence sat opposite him, her battered leather trunk already strapped to the back of the carriage. She was still wearing her faded blue day dress and the shapeless cloak, but her posture had shifted. The defensive, brittle tension that had defined her existence for 8 years was gone. She looked out the window at the rotting facade of Oakhaven, not with despair, but with the detached interest of someone viewing a museum exhibit. The carriage halted at the front steps. Victor stepped out first, offering his hand. Florence took it, feeling the solid strength of his grip through his leather glove. They walked through the front doors without knocking. The house was eerily quiet. Florence led the way down the hall to the drawing room. Agatha Hawley was sitting in her usual chair, wrapped in a shawl, her ledger open on her lap. She looked up as the door opened, a smug, satisfied expression already forming on her face. She expected to see the maid returning with her morning tea, confirming that the midnight coach had taken her problem away forever. Instead, she saw Florence. And standing right behind her, casting a long, dark shadow into the freezing room, was the Duke of Westmoreland. Agatha's smug expression shattered. The blood drained from her face so fast she looked like a corpse. The ledger slipped from her lap, hitting the floor with a loud smack. "Florence?" Agatha whispered, her eyes darting frantically between her niece and the Duke. What is the meaning of this? You were supposed to be on the coach." "There was a change of plans, Aunt," Florence said. Her voice was calm. It wasn't angry. It was simply finished. Agatha struggled to her feet, leaning heavily on her cane. She forced a sickly, trembling smile toward Victor. "Your Grace, I do not understand. Have you brought her back to punish her? I assure you, whatever she has done, I wash my hands of it. She is no longer my responsibility." "You are entirely correct, Mrs. Hawley," Victor said. His voice was like a blade drawn from a velvet sheath, smooth, polite, and completely lethal. "She is no longer your responsibility. She is mine." Agatha blinked. "Yours. Miss Penrose has done me the profound honor of accepting my hand in marriage. We are traveling to London today to procure a special license." Victor stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Florence. "I have instructed my man of business to purchase the debts on this estate. All of them. By the end of the week, I will own Oakhaven." Agatha swayed on her feet. She grasped the back of her chair for support, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The math in her head was short-circuiting. The niece she had called unmarriageable, the girl she had treated like a stray dog, was about to become one of the most powerful women in England. But she has nothing. Agatha finally choked out, her spite warring with her shock. No gentleman would want her. "I am well aware of what gentlemen want," Victor replied coldly, "which is why I am taking her away from the small, pathetic people who mistake cruelty for refinement. You will be allowed to remain in this house, Mrs. Hawley. You will be provided a modest stipend, but you will never contact my wife again. If you attempt to write to her or speak to her, I will throw you out into the street. Do we understand each other?" Agatha stared at the Duke. She looked at the absolute, uncompromising power in his face. Then she looked at Florence. She waited for Florence to gloat. She waited for the triumphant sneer. But Florence just looked at her with quiet pity. "Goodbye, Aunt Agatha," Florence said softly. "I hope you enjoy the fire." She turned and walked out of the drawing room. Victor followed her, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind them, sealing Agatha in with her empty ledger and her 3 coals. They walked out of the suffocating house and into the crisp, bright morning air. The carriage was waiting, the footman holding the door open. Victor helped Florence inside. As the heavy door clicked shut, sealing them in the warm, plush interior, the carriage lurched forward, turning its wheels away from Oakhaven forever. Florence leaned back against the squabs. The leather was soft, the air inside smelled of beeswax and expensive wool. She let out a long breath, closing her eyes for a moment. It was over. The cold was over. She felt a movement beside her. Victor reached over and gently pulled her hands into his lap. He slowly, deliberately began to massage the raw, calloused skin of her fingers. Florence opened her eyes and looked at him. "You didn't have to buy the debts," she said quietly. "It was a waste of money." "It was an investment in my peace of mind," Victor replied, not looking up from her hands. "And besides, I intend to tear the house down and plant a very large, very well-managed garden over the ruins. I believe you requested absolute control over the horticulture." Florence stared at him. A laugh, genuine and bright, bubbled up from her chest, catching her completely by surprise. It felt strange in her throat, a muscle she hadn't used in nearly a decade. Victor looked up, the sound of her laughter doing something profoundly strange to his heart. He smiled, leaning in closer. "There it is," he murmured. "I was wondering what that sounded like." Florence didn't pull away. She looked at the man who had ridden through the dark, who had frozen in the mud, who had seen the absolute worst of her and decided it was exactly what he wanted. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He was warm. He was solid. Love in the 19th century was built on cold, hard cash and brutal social arithmetic. But as Victor wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close against his side as the carriage sped toward London, Florence realized that sometimes the math was wrong. Sometimes two negative numbers collided in the dark, and somehow, against all odds, they made a positive. Florence didn't just escape a life of misery. She rewrote the rules of the game completely. She proved that a woman doesn't need to shrink herself to be saved. Sometimes she just needs to hold her ground until the right man is brave enough to stand in the mud beside her. What an absolute mic drop moment in the drawing room. If you loved watching Florence and the Duke turn the tables on her cruel aunt, smash that like button. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss another gripping historical romance. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite moment of their brutal, honest courtship? Share this video with someone who loves a fiercely independent heroine.